you believe that all the things are, I guess, matter and energy, right? Essentially.
Yeah, pretty much.
Do you think matter and energy is contingent?
Can you break down like what you're asking me there? Contingent on
Like,
what?
do you think matter and energy is contingent? Like, do you think it always existed, or I mean, do you think it is dependent on something else?
Um, I'd be inclined to say that it always exists.
Always existed. Do you think time is
Hmm.
eternal?
Do I think time is eternal? Probably, yeah. Like, I don't think that there's. I really don't believe that there's like a beginning where like things were created and like before then there was nothing. Because the way that I see it, um, I kind of view nothingness itself as kind of logically incoherent.
Oh, we agree on that, but I wouldn't say that there was nothing prior to the universe. I would probably chalk it up to like one ultimate cause, like something necessary that has some um, that's causally sufficient to bring about the universe.
Like a god or like, cause like
It
my
doesn't have to
understanding.
be.
Go ahead.
My bad. I was gonna
No,
say it
you
doesn't
go.
have to be like a god or like something with a mind. It could just be something that's necessary, something that even like an atheist or naturalist, metaphysical naturalist would agree with.
Okay.
Like it doesn't have to
So
be.
like, yeah, like, my understanding is like clearly we both agree that nothingness is contradictory in nature, so we don't have to dig too much into that, I don't think. But like my understanding is, given I think everything is composed of matter and energy, then if there was never nothing, then there was always something, and that something would be composed of matter and energy. So that kind of explains my answer to your question.
But doesn't that sort of okay? Now I don't want to be too hasty on this, but doesn't that seem like it's begging the question?
Uh, in what sense?
In the sense that like if we're talking about whether it's the case that all there is matter and energy, and we haven't concluded of whether matter and energy is contingent or not, you just assume that the thing prior to the universe would just be composed of matter and energy. But if those things
It
are
assumes that for the sake of answering the question, but that wasn't like an argument I was putting forward. Like
okay,
if
my
I were
bad.
to put forward an argument, I would probably like I know it's a lot more complex. Like there's like probably a million ways we could go about this, but like maybe the basic argument is, my belief about what composes the universe is, I mean, everything around me I know to be composed of energy and matter, and so maybe there's like an inductive argument there that since everything that I know of is composed of energy and matter, then I would think that the universe itself is right.
But don't you think we'd have an infinite regress there of a chain of infinite events? If you say
I
time
don't
is
know.
eternal, right?
I don't. So I understand what you're referencing, but my big problem with infinite regress arguments is I never understand how metaphysical things kind of escape from similar problems, right? So, like, if we had, for example, a God and God was metaphysical and God made the choice to create the universe, and I'm not saying you believe in God, but this is just an example of like a metaphysical being falling within the same infinite regress problem. Well, I would question, okay, what thought process led to God creating the universe or making that choice, and then what motivated that choice, and what motivated that motivation, et cetera, et cetera. Now there's a causal infinite regress for that metaphysical God, right? Much like you would argue that there's an infinite regress for physical things as well. So,
But doesn't that suppose that the thought that God conceives of needs to have something causally prior?
um, it does presuppose that, but I think there's other issues if you don't presuppose that.
Yeah, because something that's necessary or that's a brute fact, it's just going to be like anything uh, that happens is going to be sort of just because like it is the one ultimate cause, so it doesn't need any explanatory power prior to it.
Mm. I don't know. So, like, my problem with brute facts a lot as well is that I don't know that I believe they exist. I guess it depends what you mean by brute facts. So, like, do you just think that brute facts equals like necessary facts, or do you think there's more to it?
Uh, Something that like couldn't you could define it as like something that's acausal or something that just like is acausal and couldn't have been otherwise.
Right. So like that kind of goes against like my understand. Like for example, this is like another argument I would make. Like I induce that causality is real and causality is universal because as far as like I've observed, I don't just see random things happening. Things either have a cause that I can discern, or things have a cause that I can't discern, but after investigation, we're able to discern that cause later in the future, right? So like, I don't really know if I believe in things such as brute facts that have no cause.
Yeah, I feel like this would this the case that we're talking about would be like metaphysically unique, right? Because I can understand the intuition behind, I guess, automatically thinking there's a cause behind something because everything you know of, right? It seems like there's a cause, right? When you drop a cup on the ground, it's because like you let go, right? And that's the thing that was the cup hitting the ground was contingent off of you letting it go, right? So it's just like I can understand the intuition behind it, but it seems that you can't have an infinite regress of things. And if you want me to explain, I can get into that.
No, it's like you would. I understand why people argue this. Like, are you familiar with like the Grim Reaper's paradox?
Uh, sort of. Do you know about the sniper one? That might be more a better
It's
one
it's
from
like the
my
it's like the
understanding.
it's like the it's like the same paradox, just different circumstances. Like the idea is if there's like an infinite regress, well, there's like an infinite amount of actions, so it would take an infinite amount of time for any given thing to occur, right? And so it just doesn't make any sense. Like clearly, there's not an infinite amount of time between me dropping a cup and the cup landing on the floor, right? It's just
Hmm.
problematic. So I get that. So like again, my thing is I don't really have like an answer for the infinite regress problem, but like my answer more so to it is that okay, there's an infinite regress problem when it comes to like accepting that everything is causally related. But I just like again I see similar problems even if we assume metaphysical things. Like the only instance where this problem doesn't occur, like you said, is for brute facts. But I don't have reason to believe these actually exist unless the reason you're proposing is it's the only alternative explanation you can offer. Right? Is that it?
Uh, I guess it would be something along the lines of that because it seems like we run into an issue with like infinite regresses, but when we posit that there's something necessary or one
Hmm.
ultimate cause, it doesn't seem like we run to that same issue. So I would say that I would offer, the thing that probably doesn't have the same issue as you know,
Yeah.
the other thing.
I understand that, but like then my issue with that is that that kind of falls into the God of the gaps category of argumentation. So like God of the gaps obviously being there's some unexplained event, like maybe in like the olden days people couldn't really explain eclipses. So they say, okay, we have no way of explaining eclipses with our knowledge right now, but perhaps they're like an act of God, right? And there's no real contradiction or issue with it being an act of God. So that's what we're going to choose to believe, right? Where we're filling in the hole of our ignorance with an explanation that sounds nice on paper, but there's no real tangible evidence for it, right? And I think that's problematic.
Well, to me, it seems that like infinite regress and I guess one ultimate cause seems to be a true dichotomy to me. Like, if it's not the case that an infinite regress is possible, or at least metaphysically possible, then it seems like we would instantly be like, okay, there has to be the evidence for the one cause would just be the fact that we can't have the infinite regress. Um,
Yeah, but I
I
don't know that I don't know that that's a true dichotomy because typically when we try to kind of create true dichotomies, like we have evidence that these are the only two options, right? Instead, you're positing that these are the only two options, but A, there's no evidence for the second option, and B, there's no evidence that contradicts the notion that there might be a third option that we can find later, right? So my kind of way of analyzing this is okay, I take it as like a wash, right? Like I don't think either side is particularly supported in this instance, so I take it as a wash and I just try to act within my knowledge. And within my knowledge, causality does exist. Within my knowledge, everything is made of mass and energy. And I just take your argument, not to try to downplay it, but it kind of as speculation at best.
I don't know how if we should go about saying true dichotomies like that because I feel like you could apply that logic to anything that you believe to be a true dichotomy, and you could just be like, we could discover some third option in the future. Therefore, we can never actually assert a true dichotomy because we don't have necessarily certainty about that. But then I would just like sort of ask you, right, to sort of like posit a third option, right? Because I'm not denying the fact that it's maybe possible and an epistemic possibility that there could be a third option, but I just honestly can't conceive of this, right? So I don't see why I should even consider that in the current moment, right? And I will say about the whole causality stuff, the
Mhm.
causality stuff is only going to be plausible if, right, you solve the infinite regress stuff. If you can't solve that, right, it seems that we get to the other option, right? Because neither one of us can posit a third option that's coherent.
So I guess I just have like a higher standard of evidence. And to be clear, my standard of evidence is not certainty. I don't think that true certainty can be achieved, right? But it's just a little bit higher than what you're giving. So like I would say this still is analogous to the God of the gaps example, right? Like presumably you can make the argument that it's a true dichotomy that either events happen because of God or because of some non-theistic, more naturalistic explanation. Like that seems like a true dichotomy that we could structure, right? And back in the day, as you know, eclipses were unexplained because we didn't have the resources to kind of analyze what they truly were. So somebody could look at that dichotomy they've set up and say, okay, well, it's either God or it's not God. No non-God explanation seems satisfying, so I'm going to believe it's God. Again, right, they might not be able to provide like a third option, right? And maybe the first option of it not being God seems unsatisfying, but that doesn't mean that they should lower their standard of evidence to accept the second option that it is God to explain their gap in knowledge, even if that God explanation has no evidence behind it. And like what I would ask of you is, and this is kind of what I'm doing, to exercise kind of epistemic humility, right? And work within the bounds of our knowledge as opposed to speculating on what might be true outside of our knowledge.
Yeah, but for the whole debate, we have to work in a scope that's outside of our knowledge. Because I assume that you agree with me in the fact that we both don't necessarily know, right, whether the universe has an infinite chain of events, right, or there's one ultimate cause, right. So like it seems like if we were to apply that logic and exercise epistemic humility, it seems that we won't even continue the debate because we always considering the future possibility of us just like having wrong information or like changing our minds, and it just seems like a really like very very narrow-minded way to think, and like it seems like we won't get that far thinking that way if we were to apply that elsewhere.
I think actually we do apply it elsewhere, and it's like the realm of science. Like that's what the scientific method is, right? It's like we know that as humans, our knowledge is limited, so we're always open to the possibility of being corrected in the future. And that's why scientifically, we're always trying to repeat tests. We're always trying to branch out our knowledge to correct ourselves on the flaws of our reasoning, right? So what I'm describing is not really, it doesn't limit our ability to have conversations or to have knowledge. If anything, it's very scientific, and it's what allows us to advance our knowledge, right? Rather than biting hard onto these positions that we truly don't know, right? We work within the bounds of our knowledge to kind of acquire what we can know, and then we work from there to discover the unknowns. So if you want to ask of me, is it possible that metaphysical things do exist, right, and do explain how our universe is the way it is? I would absolutely grant that's possible. I would absolutely grant that it's, worthy to investigate that to see if that's correct. But based on everything we know so far, I would say scientifically, there's not a lot to really support it. The only thing that can be said about it, as you've said, is that there's a lot of unknowns that our material worldview can't explain at the moment, and we should investigate that, right?
I do want to say, I don't want to get into this quite yet, but I think it's good for me to clarify. I don't necessarily think the material world is, material as you say it is. Obviously, I'm an idealist, so like, saying like sort of presupposing that like the world is material. I know it's like the normal way to speak, but I'm just saying like I'm not under that presupposition that we have a material world. I'm just
Sure,
saying
I
that.
understand, but like surely you would grant that, like when you look around, like things being composed of matter and energy as opposed to being composed of, I don't know, thoughts and ideas or other abstract things, like one seems a lot more readily apparent when we observe our world than the other. Like that's what I'm trying to get at.
I feel like from a more normal, like simplistic perspective, I could agree with you. But I think that when it comes to um, you understanding, the quote unquote external world, I think it all can just be reduced down to your experience, right? Because obviously, everything that you know of, everything that you think is physical, that is perceived through the medium in which, our
Hmm.
experience lies, you know?
Sure. May I ask you a question really quickly?
Yeah, go ahead.
Sure. Let's grant that there are metaphysical things out there, right? Like things that are structured of non-physical things, not mass and energy. Let's grant that. It seems we both agree that we perceive the world and analyze the world through our senses, right? And our sense data and our senses are very physical things, right? What I would ask of you is this, right? Even if this metaphysical world did exist out there, how would we perceive it or understand it in any way, given that our senses are physical and perceive physical things, and what you're describing is the opposite of that in nature?
So I would probably reject the assumption, because you have a little bit of an embedded claim in there, like that our
Hmm.
senses are physical, which I did clarify. I am rejecting the idea that the external world is like something that's physical, or that we might not even have physical things in general. Right? I think that material is just an emergent feature from an underlying reality. That's what I think.
Sure.
Hold on, can I ask you a question?
Like, how would
Like,
we,
are
no,
y'all
No,
my
no,
bad.
Alex.
I
No,
was just going to ask, like, I guess my question to you is, even granting that, how would we ever have access to data about this underlying world?
you can underlying world. Like access in what sense?
Yeah, so like you state that like the material world is emergent of like this underlying metaphysical world, and what I'm asking is, well, even if that's true, how would we get access to like having information or knowledge about it? How would we perceive it such that we could understand and describe its nature, right?
I think in the normal way that we tend to understand the world already. I think that when we use physics terms to describe phenomenons and reality, I just think we're talking about metaphorically. Like if we use the word apple to describe, something that we perceive to be apple, under the idealist view, we're not making a claim that the apple in and of itself exists independent of the mind. We're just saying, right, it seems to function and have like some seemingly physical properties, but that's just an emergent feature of the mind. I don't know if that answered your question. If it didn't, then you can clarify.
I don't know. I'll clarify and then I'll see what your response is so we can get like a better understanding. So like the reason I'm really skeptical that even if there was like an underlying metaphysical world you could perceive it is because even with the physical world, it's really difficult for us to perceive things even in the physical world. Like there's some things you can only see with ultraviolet or infrared light, for example, or things you can only see with a highly concentrated microscope. And so if it's that difficult and that convoluted for us to perceive things that are physical just like us in our senses, then the idea that we would be able to access information about a metaphysical world that by definition lacks the traits that our senses have, lacks the traits that, as you would put it, the emergent properties of our world have, I'm very skeptical of that, and I would wonder how we could possibly do that.
Yeah, so it seems like you're asking me like if the physical world or what we view to be the physical world is an emergent feature from the mind, how would we have like epistemic access to this emergent feature that is just a byproduct of the mind? Is that what you're asking me?
I take the emergent feature that you're talking about to be the physical world. So like I'm more so
Hmm.
asking you, how would you have access to the metaphysical world, be it whether or not you think that's like the mind or something similar in nature? How would we access that if, by definition, those things have completely opposite properties of the physical world? And even in the physical world, it's really difficult for us to perceive a lot of things.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we have to necessarily go about evaluating it differently from necessarily someone who's like a physicist and also a materialist, right? We could still act on these empirical observations. All we're making is the claim that it's just not necessarily objective until observed, right? Have
Forks,
you
do you
seen?
have access to
Have you
hose?
seen? Bro, be quiet. Damn, nigga. Anyways, so fuck, he kind of threw my my train of thought process.
That's
Um,
all good. Take your time.
yeah. So what I was gonna say was, so are you aware of like quantum superposition?
No.
Yeah. So it's basically when like elementary particles exist in two states, simultaneously, and upon observation, right? We've seen this via double slit experiment that things basically it exists as a state of probability, right? And upon observation, they collapse into one possible state, right? So it seems like the physical world, right, that we know or that we think to be physical, is an emergent feature that's directly affected by the mind.
Oh, I think I understand what you're talking about now. It's some quantum physics shit. Yeah,
Yeah.
so quantum physics, yeah. It's like that's probably another thing I would say requires more investigation before we make like concrete. Hold on, my dogs are barking.
Yeah. No problem.
Yeah, I'd say that's like another example of things that are like we have so much knowledge to gain about it that I would mark it as like a point of interest worthy of investigation. But like something I find really problematic is when we find one or two things that are really interesting and challenge our worldview, but we allow those one or two things to kind of overrule or contradict our worldview that has been built off years, decades, centuries, millennia of experience and observation. I don't think that's a proportionate reaction. I don't think it's a fair reaction. And again, I would grant that's an interesting point of note that challenges my worldview that we should investigate more, but I would not take it to be a high enough standard of evidence to contradict the notion that everything we see is physical in some way, shape, or form. You know what I mean?
I definitely understand what you're saying, but it seems like while the quantity of evidence, right, in pointing out quantum superposition may not be that high, but it seems like the quality of the evidence, right? It seems like this evidence alone could put into question all the things that we've ever came to conclusions about, right? So I feel like the quality of it suffices. Maybe not the quantity, but I think the quality does.
The quality suffices investigation. I think that's a very important distinction that I've been trying to make for a while now, right? Like there's a difference obviously between arriving at a conclusion and beginning an investigation. And, hopefully, right, what we do as rational human beings is we start investigating things before we jump to a conclusion, especially when it's something so vast as determining our worldview about our entire universe, right? So like what I would grant you is your position's not entirely unfounded. It's not even impossible, right? I definitely subscribe to that. I would hope that all curious human beings would, but it's just not enough given the quantity and quality of evidence to the contrary, right? Like that being we're composed of matter and energy, the things we interact with are. We can scientifically repeat tests, right? When it comes to
Mm-hmm.
things like physics or chemistry, and the results are so reliable that they become predictable and repeatable, right? Which is to say that we have such a firm grasp and understanding of matter and energy and how it dictates our universe that we can predict and quantify how things interact with each other. Like that to me, I can't throw it all out just because of quantum particles that maybe have something to do with how we perceive them, but we really just need to investigate it more.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. Like, do think there's further investigation, but I don't think further investigation now means that we can't accept the observations that we have of this thing. And I do think the double slit experiment is something that's sort of testable and
Mhm.
repeatable, right? I mean, it's a whole experiment that demonstrates this whole particles existing in a superposition until um you know until observed, right? And it at least seems to me, and
Mhm.
I will say this, like when it comes to the standard of evidence, I think it's completely arbitrary because there are certain things, right, that you might believe that warrants a belief, right? And there are certain things that I like think that warrants, justification and a belief, right? But it seems like that part is arbitrary. So if you want to say like you're not convinced, I completely understand that. Personally,
Sure.
I am convinced of this, right?
And I respect that for sure. And like maybe I'll give like one more response and maybe we can like move on to a different point because I don't want to go too far in circles. But I would say
Sure.
just because something is repeatable does not make it scientifically valid, right? Like one of the core aspects of magicians and magic and illusions and mirages is that these are very repeatable conditions. That's why people are able to make a career out of them, right? But the fact is that it's a repeatable illusion that tricks the observer, right? The observer is not witnessing reality itself when they see a bunny coming out of a magician's top hat, right? They're witnessing a sleight of hand. They're witnessing something outside of their perception that clearly does not correspond with reality, right? And that's all to say that it's all well and good that this one study, right, or one or two studies have repeatable results about how maybe particles respond in like different ways based on if we're looking at them or perceiving them, right? But just because those are repeatable doesn't contradict every other test or study that goes against that and favors a materialist worldview, but also doesn't mean that we're witnessing something true of reality. Like there's always things that could be happening in the background that we're not perceiving. And you may argue that's true of all tests, but the difference is that when 99% of tests back each other up, right? It's called there's a word for this. Um I really wish I remember this word.
Consistency?
You know what what'd you say?
Did you say consistent, like consistency or
Uh,
demonstrably?
consistency is one word. Okay, it's like yeah, we can use the word consistency. It's not the one I'm looking for, but you get it. Like when there's a consistency, when there's a pattern established, where the tests verify each other, that helps us to know that there's not a bias or lack of knowledge that's involved in what we observe to be the conclusions of these tests. And we can't really say that for the kind of niche tests that you're pointing out that are kind of off to the side on their own a little bit.
I don't think necessarily like the tests that people do in science are like falsified, right, by the quantum superposition stuff that I'm proposing necessarily. So if I don't think those things necessarily conflict, then it seems to me that like at least it doesn't, you pointing out how this has more weight than that, right? It just, if they're not in confliction, it seems like they could actually coexist. right? We just don't understanding it. We're not understanding in a particular way that we, had thought before. But the essentially the experiences, the experiments themselves are something still, I would say valid, especially if it doesn't undercut the experiments by me proposing
Uh,
quantum superposition. But we can move on if you want.
is that the case? Okay, my understanding was that the experiment demonstrates that particles move and kind of are structured in a different way depending on if they're being looked at, right? Which is to say that it contradicts with the other notion that more standard science would suggest that particles in physics, etc., are objective features of the world, right? Their structure, their activity, their movements are not determined by who's observing them, but rather they just exist within their own set of laws. Like that's my understanding.
I don't think in like any of the scientific papers I don't want to come off dishonest, but it doesn't seem like they actually like make those claims. Now, a lot of scientists are materialists, right?
Mhm.
But it seems like you can actually still have the scientific experiments with the quantum superposition. I mean, unless you have like a direct like contradiction, like I don't. If you're going to tell me what the consensus of what scientists believe, as in like, oh, they're like objective features of reality, then would
Mhm.
that be a feature of would that be feature of science, or just feature that, or just a belief that scientists tend to hold?
Yeah, my bad. When I said objective feature of reality, it was just kind of like synonymous with saying that how they are is not dependent upon whether or not somebody's perceiving them, or like that's kind of what I meant. But like I'm inferring that from the fact that like that's to me that's like what equations are, right? Like the speed equation or the gravity equation. There's no variable in the equation to account for human beings or human perception, right? Like the equation itself is structured based off of physical laws and how those things
Mhm.
interact within their internal systems. So that's what I mean when I say that the scientific consensus that the 99% of the other science out there doesn't seem to have this dependency on human perception, and that's why I think that it's contradictory.
Could you repeat that last part? I don't think I tracked the last part.
My fault. It might have been unclear. I was just saying I take it to be contradictory because the other sciences out there, when we're talking about gravity or the speed formula, etc., there's no variable in those formulas that assert that human perception factors into the equation, right? So, in one hand, we have it saying human perception is irrelevant to the equation, and on the other, it's saying human perception is absolutely relevant on the equation. That seems like a contradiction to me.
I wouldn't say it's a contradiction because I feel like there's a hidden presupposition there. I don't think just because they aren't factored in, then they're, now contradictory just because they're not included. I just think they could just be not relevant to the particular scientific study. Like then it wouldn't be a contradiction. They just wouldn't be included. It's like comparing like the observations of like, redshift nebulas and how they imply the expansion of the universe and evolution, right? Evolution just seems to be something sort of relevant to redshift nebulas, but doesn't mean that there's a contradiction between them.
Well, I'm not okay. I'm not talking about like studies specifically. Like I'm not talking about studies that do or do not care about involving human beings. I'm talking about the formulas that we've derived from the studies themselves, right? Like there's a set gravity formula, there's a set speed formula, and the lack of inclusion of human perception, right, proves that the consensus is that human perception is not relevant to these equations playing out, right? So that's
Is
what
it?
an equation is to that's what an equation is to me anyway, right? Like it's just setting out what's necessary to reach a given conclusion, and it seems like these equations are saying human perception is not necessary to reach these given conclusions.
I don't think they make. I think the added they don't. Like, it's not necessary to make these conclusions. I feel like the way in which like we understand the speed equation mapping onto reality is based off of our empirical observation. Like I don't think you writing an equation is completely irrelevant from something that you could observe in the empirical world. A lot of the times, I think the equations are based off of what we've observed inside of the empirical world. So if you test speed, right? And you
Mhm.
test the speed equation if it's like accurate, reliable, right? That's going to be based off of something empirical. Would you disagree with
So
that?
like, but when you say that, that's true, but you have to be careful because like you're trying to imply that we're always going to be observing these things, and so our observation could be influencing the particles, but there's absolutely indirect methods of observation that have been played out. For example, right, you can set a car to drive down a raceway and you can make sure that nobody is looking at it, but you're recording it and you look at that recording later, right? Such that that car is not being impacted by current perception because it was recorded, not looked at. And still, you would be able to predict accurately how long it would take that car to go down the raceway depending on its speed, right? So there's indirect perception that should not be determining anything, right, in terms of these equations.
I do have a response to that, right? But the thing I'm about to bring up, I don't have too much of an understanding of, right? But it could
That's
kind of
okay.
respond to what you're saying, right? So we don't have to get too deep in it. You don't have to even give a full response, right? So there's something called the holographic principle. Have you ever
Mhm.
heard about that before?
I've not.
Yeah, so it's basically observations that we've seen or that we're able to quote unquote understand from, things that have been sucked into the black hole. So, do you know the black hole's event horizon?
I could not tell you.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure, if I'm not mistaken, it's the middle part of the black hole, right? But basically, I don't know if you've seen like videos of like things getting sucked into black holes. It's not literal like videos of a black hole; it's more simulated. But
Hmm.
essentially, things get sucked in upon not directly to the event horizon, but through sort of like Saturn's rings, right? It's sort of
Yeah.
surrounding the planet, right? You can think of like the things that surround the I guess the black hole as sort of like Saturn's rings, right? The thing that gets sucked into the black hole, um, basically, even though it gets like torn apart, right? The information, right, of its existence is embedded onto the black hole, even though the thing in and of itself doesn't exist, right? So it seems like when people aren't observing, right, things just exist as sort of like an information process. You don't even have to give a response to that because I'm probably not going to be able to answer much questions about it.
I
But I
probably couldn't because I'm sure what you're talking about is real, but I don't know anything about it either, so I probably couldn't ask any relevant questions, and you may not be able to give any relevant answers. So we're both a little
yeah,
ignorant on this point, I believe.
yeah, yeah. Let's
Can I
move
run
on. I
something by
do
you?
want to talk about my bad.
Oh,
Someone?
can I run something by you?
Oh, you said what?
So like, no, I was just asking if I could run something by you really quickly.
Yeah, yeah, no problem.
Yeah. So a lot of times when people think about like immaterial things, they think about the mind and its processes, and a lot of times these relate to morality, empathy, personality. I'm not sure if you agree that those are mental attributes or metaphysical attributes, so I want to ask that really quickly.
Well, do you think that would exist as baggage if I would a baggage belief, like if I were to believe that consciousness is metaphysical in and of itself?
Like, are you asking me if that would be bad for you to agree to when you say
No, no, no,
baggage?
no. Like baggage, like when you hold a belief, there are certain other beliefs that comes with holding that belief, right? I'm saying like, do you think me thinking the consciousness in and of itself is metaphysical? Do you think that would now follow that what the consciousness experiences
Um,
right, is now metaphysical?
I, with the consciousness experience is metaphysical. I'm not sure if it's too relevant to what I'm about to push forward, but you can let me know if it is. And
Oh, I don't know what you're
yeah,
about
I
to
just
go into. You can go into, and then
yeah,
we can go off if it's relevant.
sure, because like I'm not sure how relevant it'll be. I was just gonna bring up an example. There's a case called it's like the case of Phineas Gage. That's his name. And Phineas Gage was a guy back in the 1900s who was unfortunate enough to have a metal rod just straight up launched through his brain, right? And it pierced his frontal cortex or frontal lobe or whatever part that is. And he
Hmm.
survived. And the curious thing is that he survived, but after this alteration to his brain, his personality, his morality, his shame levels, these things all drastically changed. Like people would testify that he would run around the streets naked, just screaming or just making inappropriate remarks. And this was a guy, mind you, who had by all accounts been like a regular normal gentleman before this incident. And to me, why this is very relevant is because I think, okay, if these are like metaphysical processes, right? Like the mind, our personality, if that's metaphysical, I would expect that to be removed somewhat from like the causal chain that we expect of physical things, right? But here seems to be a very explicit example where personality, morality, etc., things we would expect to be metaphysical are being directly impacted by a very physical process. And something about that to me seems very kind of contradictory to like the idealist worldview.
Yeah, I think if you were to suppose that we did have at least one physical thing, and then like our consciousness interacts with this physical thing, right? It seems that if we're talking about something metaphysical, it wouldn't work. But there's the issue though. It's when we suppose like because materialists like to do this. I will say they'll be like, well, there's a rock. The rock is physical, right? And then like I can interact with my body and with the rock, and then like my body can interact with my brain, right? And then like my brain can interact with like the chemical processes that forms a thought. Therefore, they're all just physical things. But it seems like the chain starts to break down as soon as you question the initial thing that they're positing is physical, right? Which is the rock, right? And in the
Uh-huh.
analogy you brought, right? It seems like if we question that everything is physical, right? It seems like we wouldn't run into that issue, right? Because it seems like for the materialist view to work, they have to at least presuppose one thing that's physical to then like derive the chain of physical
Oh,
things that are connected to that.
I see. So do you question that the things we perceive to be physical are kind of strictly illusionary, though?
I don't like an illusion because I feel like it's like it triggers me, but like I would say like maybe like a simulation. Like so do you know how like a video game like when you um with like you're playing Call of Duty, right? Let's say you have like shit rendering, right? You render really slow, right? It's like when you turn, the map appears before you when you observe it, right? That's kind of how I
Right.
think reality sort of works
I
in a way,
see.
right? Like I think when you observe it, just like a video game, and how the information that exists prior to your observation on Call of
Mhm.
Duty, right, collapses into the map that forms the Call of Duty world. I think that's the same in like our world, really.
I have a severe problem with that because to me, when
Yeah.
I hear this, this throws our ability to have knowledge and know we have knowledge right out of the window. Because to me and a lot of other people, the physical world as we know it is the true world. It is our perception and reality corresponding one to one. And for the idea to exist that actually no, the world as it's represented to us isn't the true world, so to put it, and maybe that's like a loaded term, but that's what I'm going with. To me, that says, well, fuck. Then how do we really know anything? How do we know that the knowledge we have is true knowledge? How do we even know that our notions of idealism and the evidence we think exists for it, how do we know those things are true? That seems like an epistemic killer to me.
I don't really think so. Maybe if you're talking about observing objects, because I'm an idealist and I feel like I can function the same way that like a normal person to if they were to think that we're in a material process, right? Like even though I don't think we're in a material world, right? I still act as if we are, right? Even if we were just getting deceived by a Cartesian demon, right? All we could do is just still get deceived by the Cartesian demon and act like our reality is as true as we think it is, right?
But like
So
if you oh my fault.
yeah, I was gonna say like that seems like a more argument for like the utility. I mean, like I think you could also infer first principles and then get second principles. Like I think, therefore I am. No possibility of the contrary, and then from there we can infer other things, right? Via
Yeah,
second principles.
I think therefore I am is it only takes you so far. I think the Cartesian example you gave, the Cartesian demon, was a really good one because it's kind of similar to that. Like, surely the Cartesian demon, right? And for those who don't know in the audience, it's the idea that there's a demon who's secretly showing us everything, making us believe everything based on its whims, right? So, like, our understanding of reality is fucked because of that. And it's like, yeah, we could possibly theorize that he exists, but theorizing that he exists doesn't, like, grant us escape from him. And it's like, okay, if that's true, how would we know the Cartesian demon exists, right? Like we couldn't because we would never really know whether or not our observations supporting that, never really know whether our thought processes supporting that are actually ours, are actually true, or are just misrepresentations that he caused. And like similarly, like utility or not, you, me, everybody really, we all see the world materially, right? We all see the world physically. And it's like,
Mhm.
how do you, if that's all a misrepresentation and we have no control over that misrepresentation, I mean, aside from first principles like you mentioned, how do we know anything? I don't know.
I don't really see how like idealism really puts those things into question because like even if you say where I'm getting deceived by um a Cartesian demon and I think I'm looking at an apple at on the table when I'm actually looking at a banana. Like sure, right there,
Mhm.
even if there's like an objective reality and the banana's there and the apple isn't, one thing he can't deceive me about is that via my experience, I am seeing an apple, whether it's a hallucinate or it isn't, right? It seems like
Mhm.
something that you couldn't provide a possibility to the contrary. Like, how could I be deceived about an apple if I experience an apple? Right? It's just like,
Sure, but that's not really what I'm asking you. So, like you said, that's a first principle thing. Like he can't deceive you that you're experiencing an apple, but he can deceive you such that you don't know you're actually looking at a banana. What I'm getting at is, sure, right? You are experiencing what appears to be the physical world. That's true whether or not idealism or materialism is true. That's true as a first principle. But whether or not the world is actually like this idealistic landscape and the properties of that, the nature of that, you don't have access to. That's not a first principle, right? That's a far removed principle. And the idea that your mind is like your mind is misrepresenting reality to you, or your understanding of reality is just fucked up because of some otherwise variable and you don't really know what true reality is, it brings up a problem of, okay, then how can you access this idealistic world that you believe in? How would you ever access information or knowledge about it? You really can't because your own mind is unreliable already.
yeah, but it seems like the Cartesian demon also works under the materialist. Under the materialist, like you can be deceived about a material world. It just I don't see what about idealism that makes the Cartesian demon relevant. If you can apply the same skepticism to the materialist worldview, um, I really don't. I'm not understanding. If I'm not tracking, you can let me know. Like,
No,
uh,
it's fine. It's like, I'm not denying the possibility of the idealistic world. I'm saying that if that possibility is true, if it is the case, then we can never access it. Because if it is true, that means that the world that we're seeing right now is a misrepresentation and that nothing is really as it seems and our mind is unreliable. We can't gather knowledge or information with
I'm
an
sorry.
unreliable mind.
I'm sorry. I think there's a
What's up,
little bit
man?
of like a unintentional trauma. So
Mhm.
I think the position is like there's not an objective reality, and then like we don't know of it. Their objective reality is just something that, or what you call objective reality, is just something that is a product of the mind. It's not like we're not experiencing reality accurate. Reality, as we know it, is just something that is in the experience. Like it's not objective,
Well,
right?
yeah, the problem is this, right? Like reality as we know it is seemingly materialistic, right? And we don't seem to have control over that. We can't flip a switch to show us what reality really is. We can only experience, as you put it, the simulation of it, the materialistic version of it. And if that's the case, if idealism, as you're positing, is the case, and that's all true, then that renders our ability to rely on our mind useless. The difference between our positions is that if materialism is true, and I experience materialism, so I have reasons to believe it is true, well, then my mind is reliable. I can gather knowledge in the material world, and that is an infinitely more sustainable worldview than something that says there's actually an underlying world that we really don't have access to.
No, but I think if reality is just all mind, then we do have access to it because we do have minds.
Well, that's kind of no. I would say that's not true. So like even in like okay, even in my own worldview, that's not true. Like there's certain things that take place in the mind that we don't have access to, right? Or that we can't control, or that misrepresent reality. Dreams, for example, right? Like
Mhm.
when we're in a dream, that's a process of the mind. But unless we're lucid dreaming, we don't know we're in a dream, right? We're just experiencing some reality for a certain amount of time, and then we wake up and we go, oh, fuck, that was a dream. Just because that dream was happening in our mind does not mean that's like a real experience or that we have control over that experience, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, honestly, to how it comes across to me is like we're talking about the same thing, just slightly different. Like when you claim that there's an apple, I just think, yep, sure, there's an apple in reality, but reality is just just a product of the mind. And then I think when you're talking, you're saying I see an apple, and an apple is actually there, independent from the mind. So
Mhm.
I'm gonna be honest. It seems like the issues that you're proposing with my worldview also can be applied to the materialist worldview. So I don't really I don't think I'm like really understanding fully. Do you want to move on or like
Yeah, I suppose so. Is there I don't have anything to put forward right now. Do you have anything else that you wanted to mention?
there? Yeah, there was one thing I wanted to go over. I do think you were very dismissive of like the one
Mhm.
ultimate cause thing. I think um I feel like we're just like relying on the fact the maybe like an epistemic possibility in which there's like a third option. But I think the evidence to say that a infinite regress, right? Because if you're positing that all is material, it seems that that supposes an infinite regress. And if you're supposing that, I would just say that doesn't seem metaphysically possible. And I could get into multiple reasons why.
Yeah, it's like, so like again, the reason why I said like that we're like our positions are in a wash here, right? Because I would grant you that infinite regress is not a very tenable position, but I would also say the alternatives that I can think of are not either. So I still think, right, for example, I gave the example of a god earlier, that if it were to make choices, those choices would require motivation, those motivations would require motivation. That is still a infinite regress. And even if you wanted to argue from brute facts or necessary facts, which don't have an infinite regress, well, then things just happen just because, and that seems to contradict the fact that we're in a world which seems to have a very consistent set of causal principles existent within it.
Yeah, but you can't. If we're talking about the world that we know is contingent, then we can't posit the same. We can't posit the same. Explanations for the thing that explains why those things are to begin with. It's not going to
Mhm.
be. I don't think that's going to be sufficient, really.
Sure.
Like,
So how about this,
so
right? Like, do you grant that it's possible that there could be a brute fact that basically states all it basically states all things will also be brute facts, right? So there could be a brute facts that renders all other facts like brute by nature. Do you agree that's possible?
like, as in like some necessitarian stuff.
Yeah,
That
something like that. Like fact A is a brute fact, and fact A states that all descending facts will also be brute facts. And lo and behold, more brute facts spawn out of nowhere that just do random shit. Like that's possible, right?
when you imply random, you imply undetermined, and then like if it's necessitarian, then I wouldn't say that you could have randomness and necessity.
But then don't think of it as like necessitarianism, right? You could think of it like this: like brute fact A states that there will be other facts, right? But what these facts actually are, what they do, is undetermined. They just do random shit. Like that's what I'm trying to get across, right?
But you said like there could be this one necessary thing that determines all of the things after, I guess, after it, right?
Yeah, it's like this, okay? I know this is like a weird concept. It's the first time I'm bringing it up. So like let's say there's like fact A, and fact A says Forks is going to roll the dice 6 times, right? I will roll the dice 6 times, but the numbers I land on will be random, right?
Okay.
Yeah, so like given that's possible, if we like analyze the world through like a brute fact kind of paradigm, what you would expect just by random chance, just by probability, is that some of these brute facts would like result in our world kind of not being as orderly as it is, right? Like things not meshing together as well as they do. That's what you would expect, right? Like just given the coin toss. And so when I try to analyze the world, what I'm trying to do when I analyze the world is I'm trying to offer explanations for things that happen in the world, right? And I need to offer an explanation for why things mesh so well together, why things work within a causal chain, why things seem to depend on each other in such a correct quote unquote way, as opposed to being like a random jarble of mess. And my explanation
Okay.
for that is there probably aren't all these brute facts out there that just pop up and just do random shit. It's probably the case that our universe is very orderly, and even if you want to say that not all facts are contingent, there's probably some set of codependent facts that fuel each other and guide each other.
Yeah, so like I don't think that there are just like some brute facts that spontaneously pop up. I mean, we already agreed that like it can't come from nothing, right? You can't just have something like spontaneously. That just seems illogical, right? From just any perspective, right? So it's just like it's not that these brute facts will be spontaneously appearing. It'll just that be they always were, right? They so
They always were. So okay, here's maybe a good is like a useful example. Like a lot of people might point to the laws of logic and say the laws of logic like by nature are not contingent on anything, like they're necessary. But it probably is true that the laws of logic are codependent, which isn't to say that one law causes the other, but is to say that the laws can only function as they do because of the other laws being in place. The law of identity would not be the law of identity if the law of contradiction did not exist, so on and so forth, right? Like that's probably something
so
that we could know.
Yeah, I don't know if I like using the laws of logic as an example because how I think of the laws of logic is just like I just think they're purely descriptions of of reality. I don't think you could find the laws of logic in some immaterial place, right, or certain spatial
Sure.
place. Like I just think
I
they're
I
purely
agree.
a description of the nature of reality. I think.
Mhm, and I agree, but like I'm talking about them as separate entities for like the sake of convenience, right?
Yeah, but does it fit if it seems like it's like when you posit that they're entities, right? It's just like it seems like they're separated, right? There's things that actually like exist, right? In like a weird way that like probably we
They're
both
like we'd probably agree that they're like emergently existent. Like they exist by virtue of, right, like the stuff around us cohering by them or something along those lines. I don't know. And I'm just like treating them like this for like the sake of convenience. But like in my
okay.
mind, that is like an infinitely better explanation for the order of our universe than, kind of spontaneous brute facts, right? The idea that, sure, there are necessary facts from which all things are derived, but even these necessary facts are codependent on each other.
Yeah, well, sure, I can even grant that, but that still implies that the necessary the infinite regress is not going to be viable.
Mm, all right, you're gonna have to help me out because
Yeah,
I
yeah.
have this problem sometimes. Sometimes I get so far into the weeds that I forget what the original point was. Could you remind me? I'm sorry.
Yeah, so we're talking about because it seems that when you posit that the universe is eternal, right, and matter and energy was always there, it seems like we run into like an infinite regress problem, and then that's when we went into the whole
Ah,
like, yeah, yeah,
you're right.
deep,
No, it's
deep.
okay. Yeah, sometimes I convert from like the actual point to just having a conversation about shit. My fault.
Yeah, no problem, no
Um,
problem. No problem.
I'd probably still stick to the idea that all worldviews are probably going to be problematic, right? In terms of trying to break down foundationally what began it all or what the beginning really was. Um, fuck. I'd probably say because like even with like the necessary thing, even for like to assume that there was like a necessary beginning, it's like that would still imply like an eternal time because something being necessary, not contingent, means there was no predecessor. There would still be some kind of invocation of like time being eternal there, right?
It depends on how you define time, right? Because I think if you define time as change, right, I
Mhm.
think that the necessary thing has to be. I don't think one event occurring, right, is time, right? I just think that's some sort of causal event, right? I think you can only say time when it's the continuous progression, right? And I don't know if you ever heard this, but like a lot of the times when people were talking about the necessary thing that brought about the universe, they're talking about something that's almost immaterial, right? Something that right, doesn't doesn't change in the conventional way that we understand it, right? It just has
Yeah,
some causal
yeah,
sufficiency to bring about the universe, but not
the
causal the way you
uncaused cause.
understand.
Is that what you believe in the uncaused cause then, or just some
Yeah,
form?
I believe in. Well, I'm a theist, but I'm not arguing for God, so I'm not going to go into that. I can even agree with some like metaphysical naturalist stuff, necessary,
Yeah.
blah blah blah
It doesn't have
stuff.
to. It doesn't have to be God, but like again, like my core problem is this. Like I could even grant that there's an uncaused cause. My problem is that A, it would still be eternal, right? Because by the nature of being uncaused, there's no predecessor, so it's always existed, right? And then B, even if it's always existed, its actions or the consequences of its existence, those are still within some kind of causal relationship, right? So what you're saying is there's this eternal being that started everything or that everything is derived from, take your pick. And it's like, okay, but there's still like an infinite chain leading back to that, primordial entity, whatever you want to call it. That still seems like infinite regress.
Where does the infinite chain comes in? Because you said it's an infinite chain until it leads up to the necessary being. But the
Uh-huh.
whole reason of positing the thing to be necessary is so you don't have an infinite regress. So where does the infinite amount of things come from?
Sure. So let's treat the uncaused cause as zero, right? To represent how it's always been, right? Let's treat it as zero.
Sure.
Um, like what I'm saying is that okay, well then from zero. it does something or it causes something, and that thing is one, and then one causes two, two causes three, etc., right? But it all goes back to zero. There has to be some loop, some connection back to zero, back to the beginning of an eternal start. And to go back to the beginning of an eternal start, right, down a chain of causes and effects, is by definition a form of infinite regress. So I don't see how this escapes the problem of it.
Infinite regress is where maybe we might be understanding infinite regress in different ways. How I understood an infinite regress is just like an endless amount of events occurring, like is it like in causal relation to each other. Is that
Yeah,
how
I see
you
that's
understand it?
exactly. Yeah, that's exactly how I understand it. So, like, what I'm saying is there's probably going to be some time, right, between 0 and 1, right? Because 1 in of itself is not eternal, it's not uncaused, so it can't be 0. And if there's time between 0 and 1, and then from 1 is a delineation of all other things, that still falls into the problem of infinite regress, because there's still a causal chain, and the causal chain still goes back to 0.
But I don't think it follows because there's a causal. Are you saying that there's an infinite amount of numbers between like 0 and 1? Like, and so it follows that there would have to be an innumerable amount of causes, like from,
That's a
the
part of it,
initial.
yeah. That's
I
absolutely a
don't.
part of it. Yes.
Yeah, I don't think there are an infinite number of causes. Like let's say for example, if you if you were to cut a cake, right, or at least attempt to cut a cake infinitely, assuming that you could try, right, and you have like almost infinite speed, you wouldn't reach something infinitesimal. Eventually, there would be a stopping point for how much you cut the cake, right? You could either say the stopping point would be something called a hydron, or you could see it'd be an elementary particle that exists in a superposition. So you couldn't cut something infinitely, and so if you couldn't cut something infinitely, that means the parts that are contained of something don't need to be infinitely causally sufficient. If you get what I mean, like they don't need. There doesn't need to
I
be an infinite
understand.
chain of causal events.
I understand, but it's like weird because okay, fuck, it's weird because like this is making me think of JJK so much. But like you know how in JJK like Gojo fucking his infinity, right? Like it's explained that what it does is it slows down the speed of something by half, and then it keeps on halving the speed such that it never arrives at its target, right? It's something like that. Like in a way, not to sound too corny, there really is infinity all around us, right? There really is an infinite amount of actions that we perform simply because our actions, our motivations for those actions can always be halved again and again and again, theoretically, right? And so, like, again, that's another example of I just really think that I really think that there's like such a limitation on human knowledge that these are things that we can't really conceive of. We don't understand how the world works as it does. We don't understand how we get over these infinities, yet it seems like we do. And this is probably just another example of that. I can't offer you a solid explanation for how we override those infinities. I just
Mhm.
acknowledge that they do exist. I can't go beyond that. I'm sorry.
Yeah, yeah, no problem. That's not a problem. It's completely understandable. But I do think you did go back to like saying that we can have something infinitely. Like you, at a certain point, there is a stopping point where you just can't have something. Like there's a hydron, right? And there's like an elementary particle. Like depending on what view you have, right? There's just a stopping point for how much you can cut something. Like it just completely breaks down. It's no longer the thing you're cutting it.
Yeah,
So
but it's
I
like
would
I can't
even.
offer an explanation for how that infinity is overrided, right? Much like I can't offer an explanation of how, our reality seems like it would go into an infinite regress, but it doesn't, right? Or it seems like even if the metaphysical world existed, it would still go into an infinite regress, but it doesn't. These things I just think are these theoretical arguments that we could ponder over for all time, and just because of how limited human knowledge is, we could never really truly know.
Um. So and this isn't an insult towards you, but I feel like we're like a lot of people like to hide behind complexity. Now, I understand there are a lot of things that are really complex, and you might not be comfortable in giving an explanation. But it seems that like we've run into this point. Maybe it might just be discussion. The discussion in and of itself just might be like too complex, where it just leads all to these like things that we don't want to make statements about, or like evidence that we don't want to necessarily buy. Then I would say like it might not be the topic for you because it seems like your worldview follows. Well, we have the things that I am confident in, and because I have these things that I'm confident in, I'm going to say that all exists is just the things that are confident in. I'm confident in, aka the material world. And then like anything that puts into question, I'm just not going to actually engage with it, and I'm gonna say it's too complex, or I don't know, or like
Mhm.
just one of those things. And that's not an insult.
I understand where you're coming from. That's strictly not what's being said. So like what's being said is that I a pet peeve of mine is I think that as humans we're really arrogant. So we run into these things that we really, really want to explain or proclaim that we understand, even though we really don't, right? So to that end, I think I understand a lot of things about our world and I shape my worldview around those understandings. But when I come across things I don't understand, I can't just flip my worldview because of those. Otherwise, I would have no worldview. Like I said earlier, all I can do is say, those are interesting questions. Let's investigate further. When it comes to this specific example where we're talking about infinity or infinite actions, I truly don't have an explanation. In fact, I would challenge you to give an explanation, right? We just went over the paradox of how anytime you make an action, right, when you're walking to the door, the distance can always be halved infinitely. That seems to be true, yet we arrive at the door anyway, right? Now, presumably, I don't think you think we have infinite speed. And what I would challenge you, right, to kind of showcase how we should have more epistemic humility, I would challenge you to give an explanation as to how we arrive at the doorway, right? What explains that?
Yeah, I 100% can answer that question. I also do think I did. Did you hear my whole like cutting the cake analogy?
I did, but my problem with that, and maybe you can re-explain it, is that it sounds like you were saying, well, clearly there's like no infinity, or clearly this is like not an infinite thing because we do arrive at the end point. But I don't really think that's addressing, how the infinity that seems to be there is actually overridden. It just seems like you're saying it doesn't exist because we complete it, right?
No, no, that's not the reason why I was saying. I'm
My
just saying
fault.
like yeah, no, it's fine. I was just more saying like the infinity isn't there to begin with. There is a stopping point for how much you there like points in distance. Like especially like essentially if you go small enough, space just isn't there. Like it's not there. Like if you try to cut a cake infinitely, right? You divide, keep getting smaller. You won't reach something infinitely small. Essentially the cake will completely break down into like a superposition that only exists on the quantum level, like in two states simultaneously, right? You
I
won't
don't know
be
if I
able to
agree with
you
that.
won't be able to cut in the physical terms that you're saying you are.
I think you're just talking about what's, outside of human ability, right? Like, it's impossible for us to like fold a piece of paper 8 times. I don't know if you guys know that. Go try it. You can't. But like the idea that we'll divide, and eventually get to the end point, that's not something that's really testable. So we have to be theoretical about it, right? And theoretically, as far as theoretical analysis goes, there never is an endpoint because whatever number we can have, we can divide it into a theoretical half of that self, right? So I don't believe in this super space or super cut, however you would label it. Again, the only way we could talk about it is through theoreticals, and theoretically, signs seem to point towards there's always divisible by 2, right?
Yeah, so when you put it in numbers term, I actually think infinity can exist conceptually, just not metaphysically, right? Because when we talk about metaphysically, we're talking about the world, right? Not just something a figment of the imagination, right? So theoretically, right, there's some you could infinitely divide a number, right? But when it comes to like dividing space, that just doesn't work, like as we know. Like
Do you think
conceptually, yes, it's infinitely divisible, right? But not metaphysically.
here's what I would ask you, and like again, this is like an example of human knowledge being so limiting, and I think this is an example of where we have to perform epistemic humility. What is the smallest amount of space made of?
That's a little bit ambiguous to me. My bad. I might not be following. Like, what
It's
is in
okay.
like
Like
a length?
whatever the smallest particle you can think of is. You don't even have to have a name for it. Imagine the smallest particle you can, and then tell me what that smallest particle is made of.
Uh,
Like, what's its skeleton?
Skeleton. When you say made of, it kind of seems like it's implying parts, right? And on the quantum level, space just doesn't seem to exist, or space doesn't even seem to like be a fundamental feature of reality. I can give you an example, right? So, like, have you heard of quantum entanglement?
No. Okay, all this quantum shit you'll have to break down. Assume I know
Yeah,
nothing
okay,
about it.
100%. No, it's 100% understandable. So basically quantum entanglement shows that like particles can interact despite the space between them, right? So it seems like if particles can like you affect one of the particles, right, and then like the other particle, right, like really far away is like affected, right? So it seems like regardless of the space between them, these particles are able to like almost interact on like some underlying reality that isn't space.
I'm not sure I follow how this demonstrates that at a certain point there is no space.
Because it seems that regardless of them not occupying the same space, they're interacting on in a different means by space. Because like obviously you would say like an interaction occurs when something meets another thing, right? That sort of like presupposes space, right? Two things like sort of have some like spatial, really close spatial proximity, and that like, causes some interaction. But in the instance of the particles, there's no spatial proximity, right? They're not next to each
Yeah.
other at all. Yet when you
Like,
affect one particle, right, you affect the other. And I think truly
there's-
that implies that there's
yeah.
some sort of underlying, more fundamental reality in which these particles are actually like interacting, like
I
maybe like on some information
this
process.
this just sounds like a micro level of gravity. Like we know that clearly the Earth and the Moon don't occupy the same space, but if you disrupt either, the other is going to be vastly affected in ways that are very obvious, right? Like
No,
that's to say that whatever explains the relationship between these two particles probably exists occupied within space. Like that, this doesn't seem very compelling towards your point.
it's like two
It,
particles that come into existence at the
bro, be
same
quiet,
time.
Alex. This is a debate. Be quiet. Holy
It's a
shit.
debate.
Holy cow. Yes. Anyways,
Okay.
so
Poor
my
guy.
bad, Torts. Could you please repeat what you said? I did not hear you.
Yeah, this
Well, I
just
did
sounds like
hear you. I just forgot.
oh, it's okay. I said it just sounds like a micro version of gravity, right? Much like how clearly the Earth and the Moon don't share the same space, but if you disrupt one, the other will also be disrupted in obvious ways. Whatever the nature of this relationship is probably occupied within space, right? That's why I'm not very convinced by this.
What's the like? Sure, like there's an interaction that occurs, but there's a force that we know that occupies space, which is gravity, right?
Yeah, this seems like a micro form of gravity in some way, or some other attractive force.
Microform.
There's some other attractive force. I'm not sure.
I don't know. I mean, I don't see like if because it seems like if space is the medium by which these things are interacting, at least comparatively to the things that we know interact in space, it seems like it would operate sort of at least functionally similar, and this seems like it doesn't.
Okay, when you say that these things are interacting or that one disrupts the other, like how exactly is it? Maybe you could help me better visualize what you mean.
By the way, I'm not a quantum physicist, dude. So
It's
there's only a
okay.
stopping there's
We're
like a
just
stopping point when it
debaters.
comes to questions.
Yeah, we're just
um,
just
but I probably have to look up. I probably have to look up. I probably have to get back to you maybe outside of the debate, but I don't have a response for what you're saying.
that's okay. So like again, this like probably falls into like the I'm trying to explain the world I live in. Like when I see something act in one way, like the Earth and the Moon with its gravitational forces disrupting one disrupts the other, and I observe like a similar phenomena of two things occupying different points in space, yet disrupting one disrupts the other, I would probably assume like a similar kind of attractive force, just on a micro level. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I mean, I guess without the added information, I can see why that might be reasonable. I mean, I don't have a response or like, nope, it's this. Like,
That's
I
okay.
need to do more research into it myself.
That's okay.
All right.
Yeah,
Does that conclude everything, or is there anything you wanted to touch upon?
I think so. I'm really impressed with myself. I think usually when I get this deep into a conversation, I just kind of like I need a map. I get lost.
Yeah, yeah, me too. Me too. Shit, let me
Word.
end the recording. Good conversation, good debate for real.
Yeah. W. It's all thanks to my coffee.